Many of you may have asked yourself, how in the world did they get Larry Weaner to come to Lakeshore Park? And when I say they, I also want to mention that this is a joint venture tonight between the Knox County Master Gardeners on our 40th anniversary and the Knoxville Plantsmen. And you'll hear about the Knoxville Plantsmen in just a minute. But to answer the question, how in the world did we get Larry Weaner here? And it starts with a long time ago, a man by the name of Tom McAdams, who really is responsible for everything that's happened here at the park in the last 30 years with the support of Jenny and Dee Haslam and the whole Haslam family, primarily, as well as other donors, to set a very, very high standard for everything that is to be done here at Lakeshore Park. And that started most recently with the hiring of a landscape architect by the name of Thomas Woltz of Nelson Burns and Woltz. And when you hire the best, this is what you get at Lakeshore Park. And when the plan was to put in a meadow, a man like Thomas Woltz is very, very good friends with a man like Larry Weaner, who is also the very, very best at landscape meadows. And so, as a result of hiring Thomas Woltz, we got the connection to Larry Weaner. And so we now have Larry Weaner's work, his firm of work here at Lakeshore Park. At this time, I'd like to introduce Kyle McCoy. I'm just going to tell you, he's the brains behind the starter, the initiator, and everything else of the Knoxville Plantsmen.
Wow, what an amazing event. The beautiful weather and a great crowd of people who love to garden. And then finally, we've got Larry Weaner here to speak to us. But before, and I have that enviable task of introducing Larry, and so I've spent some time with him today trying to get to know his particular personality. This is a collaborative effort tonight. The Knoxville Master Gardeners program is well known, and Caesar and others have been involved in it for many years. It's about education as well as getting out the word for gardening. And the Knoxville Plantsmen is the other partner tonight. And that's a little harder thing to define because we don't have a motto, we don't have bylaws, we don't have rules, we don't even take dues. So we are kind of just an organization that has morphed into what I would call a social outlet for gardeners. Larry Weaner has been at the forefront of the landscape design program for the last 40 years. He has grown up in Philadelphia. He's a lifelong Phillies, 76ers, and Eagles fan. And so right now he's crowing about the Eagles because of their big win in the Super Bowl, a blowout no less. And he has been in the business for over 40 years. In 1990, he started a very innovative program, which was an educational program. It's called New Design. And if you go on his website, he has programs that you can actually sign up for. Many of you have done these programs, but he had started this when he went to a Longwood seminar that was a little bit less than perfect, and he thought, I can do a better job than that. So he started that in 1990, and it still goes on today, and it's an avid program. Let me make sure I tell you the right way so you can go on the website. New Directions in American Landscape. In addition, he wrote a book called New Designs Landscape for the Future in 2017 that won the American Horticultural Society Award as the best book in garden design. Today you can see his work already. We are in year 2 of 4 as this meadow starts, and you can't help but be impressed. I was over here Saturday just walking through the meadow and the insects and the birds, and it's just a beautiful space. And then to top it off, he's going to have the actual top of Lion's View, which is how the road Lion's View got its name, so it promises to be even better in the future. So with that said, let's give an East Tennessee round of applause for Mr. Larry Weaner.
I am going to make an extra effort to try to put this mic actually in here. There we go. I'm not very mechanically inclined, so I'm proud of myself. Wow, it's so exciting to see the enthusiasm here. I'm kind of afraid to do this lecture, to be honest with you. There's so many of you out there, and you're so, and that all the gracious words that the introducers gave for me. So it's really exciting to be here. And I've been in Tennessee quite a bit in the last few years. And you should know, and before I start talking about a couple of gardens, there's some very innovative work going on in Tennessee, particularly as it relates to prairie and savanna. And I'll talk a little bit about it in the beginning. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the Southeastern Grassland Institute. Quite a few of you are. Look into it, because what's going on, a gentleman named Dwayne Estes is running it, and it's just cutting edge, changing literally what people think about the landscape in Tennessee and much of the Southeast. So just look into it, the Southeastern Grassland Institute. I'll show you a picture or two before I get started here. And I'm one image ahead, there we go. So I'm going to talk about meadows, woods, and water. I'm going to talk about two properties. I don't want to glance over a whole bunch of properties because I want to get into a little bit of the rationale behind each of them. The first one will be meadow dominated, and it's a large 40-plus acre meadow that was planted. And the second one will be a very small little 1 acre, less than 1 acre property that is mostly woodland with a little meadow patch and some water. So all three things will actually be in here. We didn't lie. And so let me get started. So the first question, where am I? If you're interested in planting native plants, and I will be talking about native plant landscapes by and large, I am not a purist. There is nothing evil about non-native plants, but there's something really good about native plants, and that is that our insects, birds, and wildlife have co-evolved with them, and they need them. So because there's some non-native plants in a landscape, that is not a problem as long as there are a bunch of native plants in that same landscape. So that's all I'll say about the philosophy of it. But what does it mean? What do you mean by a native plant? Native to Tennessee? Is that native? Is that the best plant to plant on your property? Maybe and maybe not. Because this is an ecoregion map of the state of Tennessee. And all of those, each color represents an ecoregion. There's the Blue Ridge, there's the Central Plateau, and each one is a different place. And so, in a way, if you extend that Tennessee Plateau, that's that light green near the center and big, up into Kentucky, which it does continue up into there, plants don't care what state they're in, they care what environment they're in. And so consequently, when you're thinking about, I want to use native plants because they're going to be highly adapted to the soils and hydrology and environmental characteristics of my property and where I am, you want to talk about the ecoregion you're in. Easiest thing in the world, just Google ecoregion map of Tennessee, and here it comes, and they're named, and figure out where you live and which one you're in. And those are the plants that you're looking for if you really want to be native. And this is Dwayne Estes, who I mentioned a few moments ago. And he runs the Southeastern Grassland Institute. And the work they are doing is incredible. And New Directions of the American Landscape, the educational arm of our landscape design office that Kyle mentioned a few moments ago, took a tour of folks down, ran a program here. It was people from generally this area that attended. But we put it on. Dwayne Estes led the tour, and it was at the Bridgestone Firestone properties. And the work that they've done there is incredible. Restoring, in some cases, they have actually restored prairies without planting them, by just managing them similar to as the Native Americans did hundreds of years ago. And it's really fascinating stuff. I'm not going to go into it much more than that, but they have a great website, and I would definitely look into them. And this is actually a prairie that was not planted, but is the result of management practices based on the research of what the historic landscape of the central plateau of Tennessee was. And even up in New York, in the Wall Street Journal, this is an article by Janet Marinelli called "The Forgotten Grasslands of the Southeast." Evidently, what has recently been discovered is if you let land go, as you all know, it will turn to forest. So the assumption was, for many, many years, that the pre-European landscape here was primarily forest. But it wasn't. Certainly not in the Tennessee Plateau, at any rate. It was actually grasslands and savanna with wide open spaces, grasslands, the kinds of landscape that you're seeing a picture of here. And it's because Native Americans burned it. It's because bison were here, grazing on it. And the historic landscape was not woods. And I didn't want to go here, but it's so interesting. I didn't want to take up the time. But on that tour that Dwayne Estes took us on, and we were looking, we were walking through these vast restorations that were just stunningly beautiful. And it was really inspiring. However, the most inspiring part of the day was at the end of the day, there's this prairie restoration out there. We just walked through it. It's amazing. The diversity, the insects, the birds, the plants, unbelievable. But on this side of the road, they hadn't done any work, and it was a woodland. And Dwayne took us into the woodland just a few steps in from the road. And he's pointing, the woods, the floor of the woods is pretty depauperate, not much growing. And he shows us this little plant. We're talking 2 leaves, about that big. And it's wild quinine, Parthenium quinquefolium. And then he walks and he shows another little plant. Same thing. It maybe has 1 little leaf that big. And it's Eryngium, which is rattlesnake master. And he shows us one more, and it was some kind of a helianthus sunflower that I wasn't familiar with. But again, there's one over there, and there's one over there, and there's like 1 little leaf. And he said, all of these plants that you find in this forest that are what are called conservative species, species that have a very strong association with a particular environment. They can't just grow anywhere. They will grow in certain conditions, and if they're not in that condition, they will not proliferate. Every plant that he found in there was a prairie plant that would have grown in the open sun, and they were just little tiny remnants of what used to be there. And the woodland that grew up was not the historic landscape of at least the Tennessee Plateau and in that area. So the fact that, and that's how they figured this out, because they said, well, how come in this forest all there are prairie species? Even though they're hardly living anymore because they're not getting sun, but a few leaves are here and there, and you won't find a woodland species in there. So, other than very generalist things that kind of grow everywhere. So I won't go any farther because I want to actually have time to talk about what I came here to talk about. But this is a book called Forgotten Grasslands of the South, and Reed Knox is an iconic ecologist. He resides in Florida, but he has done research for many, many years and is highly looked up to in the ecology world and has done research in the Southeast along these lines. All right, so let's look at the first project which I talked about, which is a meadow. It's in northwest corner of Connecticut, and it's approximately 40 acres, and it was planted. And here's looking across it at the house. But there's a couple of points that I want to make talking about this meadow. First of all, when I was early on involved in the project prior to actually planting it, and there was a meeting with myself and the homeowners, the clients, and the landscape architect who had brought me in on the project, and the property manager and the contractor who was planting trees, and it was, the big meeting to kick off what we were going to do for the meadow. And the questions were directed to me. Okay, how do we prepare for planting this meadow? And the first comment was, well, the soil is really pretty bony. It's not very good soil. Do we want to bring in topsoil? No. The next question was, well, what about some compost? Should we till in some compost? No. How about fertilizer, some starter fertilizer as you might do with lawn? No. Should we set up some irrigation? There's a big place for irrigation, but that was brought up. Is there going to be irrigation needed? The answer was no. And the final question that really cast a lot of doubt on the validity of hiring me was, when do you want to plant it? And the answer was, I think we're going to plant this the first week of July. So, you know, people were being polite, but that's about the best I can say for it. But here's the deal. Basically, tilling things into the soil, when you till soil, you're bringing, first of all, you're breaking up the soil horizons. You know, nature does not till soil. And this was a fairly remote, high elevation site that had likely never been plowed and tilled. And if I'm going to go in there and till it, you know, the highest organic matter is up top, just like a woodland, and as you go down, it becomes more mineral soil. It's not all homogenized. So first of all, I'd be taking a soil structure or soil horizons that had not been disturbed, which is a good thing, and be maybe the first human in history to disturb it. So I don't want to do that. Second of all, there are a lot of weeds in our world, many of which are highly aggressive plants that are not native to here and have the ability to overcome native plantings because of their level of aggressiveness. And when you till, you bring up weed seeds that are too deep to germinate but are still viable. You create a situation where anything that blows in is going to germinate, and you have created a very large obstacle in terms of getting your plants that you're planting to become dominant over 40 acres as opposed to the weeds. And the other thing is, we are looking at the soil that is there and picking the plants that grow in a bony, fairly dry, infertile soil. And there are plants, you know, butterfly weed that everyone wants for the monarchs, and you can see them out there just getting started, just a few plants. They take a few years, but they're out there, a few of them flower, and you can find them at this stage. Butterfly weed in the Dust Bowl, back in the Depression, when the prairie, which is a drought-resistant plant community, almost as drought-resistant as you can get outside of a desert, when the prairie dried up, butterfly weed was out there scattered around, still flowering, not even looking like it cared. And so the point here is, if you've got dry, gravelly soil, there are native plants that are happy to be there, and you don't need to make the soil better. If you've got a poorly drained, heavy clay, there are native plants that want to be there. If you've got a nice, rich silt soil, silty loam, great. There are lots of plants that want to be there. So the idea here is not to make this homogenized, perfect situation for any plant. Any plant wants to grow. Nice drainage, fertility, good amount of moisture retention. Almost any plant will grow there. And that means you can plant almost anything in it and it will probably do well. But the problem is every weed will grow there also, and fast. And you do a little garden bed and you make everything nice and you put compost in the soil and you fertilize, and so it works out fine. But you can weed a garden bed. You can't weed 40 acres. You can't eat 3 acres. You can't weed a half an acre. So the point here is, you got to start putting plants in a position to be much more self-sufficient. Never totally self-sufficient. There will always, especially in the establishment phases of these plantings, they will always require some forms of guidance. But it can't be weeding every single thing that you don't like by hand. So, putting the plants where they want to be, they grow. What kind of soil do I have? What kind of hydrology I have? What are the plants that grow that in that kind of condition? All right, now they don't need the requirement of putting all these things that's going to make weeds grow. Even the weeds will utilize all of that help better than those native plants. And the whole thing of tilling, of disturbing the soil, bringing up more weed seeds, matching the plants to the environment, are some of the reasons why these things actually can work. And there's a whole series of strategies that are intended to, in aggregate, stack the deck in favor of the species that you're planting over the weeds, especially in the establishment phases. Now, when you get to this stage, it becomes very easy to keep the weeds down because the plants are doing 90% of the work for you. A weed, that's 4 feet of dense intermingled vegetation. It's not like a block of one plant and then another plant. They're all intermingled. They're dense. There's plants growing low. There's plants growing in the middle height. There's plants at the top 3-4 feet. Look underground if you could. There is shallow fibrous roots. There are fibrous roots kind of at the mid-level. There's tap roots that are going around down very deep. And at this point, a weed seed falling into there doesn't have much of a shot. There will always be weeds, but they're going to be here and there in the gaps. The trick is getting from the point where it was nothing to that. Because in the beginning, every plant grows, I don't care if it's a 60-foot tree eventually, it starts off this big. And so the plants you planted are only this big. So the heavy management comes in the formative couple years, year 1, 2, more or less. And then the plants are taking over for most of the work. So let's look at this landscape. And in fact, the fact that it was a poor, infertile soil allowed me to plant a very highly diverse meadow, more so than if it was a really rich, beautiful alluvial soil. Why? Because, okay, I'm going to pick the native plants that are adapted to the condition that I'm going to plant them in. But within those native plants, some are more aggressive than others. So if I want the optimal diversity, I'm going to plant them all. However, if I do that, and if it's a rich soil, particularly if the most aggressive plants are going to blow away the less aggressive ones. And they will become dominant, and I will not have achieved a highly diverse meadow, even though it is native. Because the soil was poor, those aggressive plants cannot get as dominant as they would have in a richer soil. And so consequently, in a poor soil, I can use all the diversity I want, because the more aggressive species will not be able to just form a solid, dense cover and blow everybody else out of the water. And in a rich, beautiful soil, I'm still going to plant native plants that are adapted, but I'm not likely to plant some of these more diminutive specialist species along with the aggressive ones, because they will get beaten out. So you're not just thinking about plants in isolation anymore. You're thinking about plants in competition, and plants at a scale that you can't micromanage it to the level that you do in your garden. So let's just look at this planting that was poor soil with no fertilizer, no compost, no topsoil, and no irrigation. And you say, well, how can you not irrigate? Live plants, yeah, you need to irrigate them to get established. Can't let them dry out. I don't care if they're drought-resistant native perennials or not. But from seed, if it doesn't rain for 2 months, the seed sits there, it thinks it's still in the bag, and when the rains come, the germination happens. And heavy watering is just going to help the weeds more than it's going to help those plants. So let's look at the diversity of this poor soil landscape that really got no help other than picking the right plants. That's Indian paintbrush. And another thing I want to talk about, I was talking about, okay, what's the ecoregion? You're in Tennessee, not all plants are native to Tennessee are going to be adapted to where you are. Look at the ecoregion and use that as your guide. Well, that Indian paintbrush, wild blue indigo, Baptisia is the plant coming up in the middle there, but that Indian paintbrush is native to Connecticut. But it is only native to more neutral or higher pH soils derived from limestone bedrock in Connecticut. And that's probably 5% of the state. So if I'm in 95% of Connecticut, this plant's probably not going to do well for me. But if I'm in the Marble Valley, and we're in the Marble Cathedral here, which is where that is, the Marble Valley in Connecticut, northwest corner of Connecticut, that plant is perfect. And to give you an example, I have another client farther south in Westchester County in New York, and his favorite plant is Indian paintbrush. And he said, oh, you got to plant Indian paintbrush. And I said, well, I can plant it, but I don't have much confidence it's going to grow here. And he said, well, look, it's seed. Let's try it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And we planted it. And unlike these big drifts of it that we have in Connecticut, where it is native, you can walk for 10 minutes that way and find one, So is it there? Yeah. Is it taking anyone's breath away? No. So let's just look at the diversity here. That's Parthenium quinquefolium, wild quinine, which is one of the plants I just mentioned that Dwayne Estes pointed out to us that was a tiny thing in the woods. That's where it actually grows. And there's Monarda fistulosa, and there is one of the Leotris, blazing star species, and there's rattlesnake master, and there's a different blazing star, that's spicata, one that likes it down in that's a little micro habitat, a small little area where, low spot where water collects. It has a whole different suite of plants than the rest of it, which is more upland. Butterfly weed, Monarda fistulosa, or bergamot on the left. There's more rattlesnake master in there. There's Allium cernum, or nodding onion. There is Queen of the Prairie and Culver's root, two plants that like it wet, and that's another drainage that comes out of the woods that's wetter. Put the plants where they want to be. If you have a plant in a garden, it's kind of sitting by itself, and it's watered, it gets all, whatever sunlight is coming in, it gets it all, it's getting watered, maybe it's getting fertilized, and that plant can survive and even thrive outside of where it grows in nature. Because it's easy, you're helping it out constantly. But the plants in there, they're intermingled. Nobody's getting all the sunlight. They're intermingled. They're getting some at the top and what filters through, and they're competing with each other for water and nutrients. And consequently, those plants are not operating as efficiently because they are in competition. And because of that, they need to be more closely associated with the kind of environment that they grow in nature. And that's a big takeaway when you're talking about anything outside of the garden bed scale and trying to restore some kind of a native landscape. It's rare in nature that you just see one big block of plants. You do see it, but especially in the prairie and the meadow, things tend to be diverse and intermingled. And blazing star in, oh, the other blazing star wasn't in the low spot. I was wrong. This is the low spot blazing star, Leotris spicata and Virginia mountain mint. The mountain mints are some of the most amazing pollinator plants, particularly for bees, that you could plant. But again, put the plant where it wants to be. There is Pycnanthum virginianum, which is a wetland form of mountain mint, and there's Pycnanthum muticum, which has become popular in the garden trades because it has a gray bracts under the flowers that last a long time. That likes it moist but not overly wet. And then there's Pycnanthum tenuifolium, which is called upland mountain mint, which will tolerate very dry conditions. And then there's Pycnanthum incanum, which grows in dry woodlands. And so the point is, you don't just plant them all anywhere. You understand where they're going to grow if you want them to be very self-sufficient. Here's Indian plantain, Cacalia atroplicifolia. And there's aster and stiff goldenrod, probably New York aster and stiff goldenrod. And goldenrods are wonderful plants. However, there is such a thing in certain situations as a native weed. And Canada goldenrod is highly aggressive with an expanding root system that in most situations will decrease the diversity because it's an example of a native plant that will blow away most of the other ones. And so is it a good plant? It has a beautiful flower. You can find bees all over it. There's all kinds of good things. But if you want a diversity of floral, whether it's to look at or for pollinators, that plant is not your friend, even though it's native. But, you know, I talk about that frequently, but I don't want to dissuade people from planting goldenrods because the vast majority of them are wonderful plants, including stiff goldenrod, which is that one. And here's upland ironweed, not the wetland ironweed that is actually planted and coming up in the wetter area out here. And blazing star again. And here is in the fall fringed gentian. So the point is, this is a highly diverse meadow planting. And if I have a rich floodplain soil, I can't do anything that diverse because the plants will be more aggressive, and the more aggressive plants will win out. So we start understanding what you accomplish and, you know, and when. So let's move down to meadow on the very small scale. And this is a meadow that was planted with both seed and live plants. And one of the things I will say, folks like to talk about, and a lot of folks plant meadows with just plugs, which are tiny little plotted plants or potted plants to plant a meadow. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. However, in a true meadow that has the diversity of species and the weed suppressive characteristics that we are shooting for in a meadow planting, you might find 5 plants in a square foot. Growing low, growing mid, they're intermingled and the root systems are the same thing. If you're going to buy plants to plant a meadow garden, you're never going to buy 5 plants per square foot. So even meadow plants kind of spaced out. It's a meadow by plant species, but it's not really a meadow by composition. And so in general, I would say that planting live plant meadows, which is a good thing because some seeds take 6-7 years. Some come in the second year. Black-eyed seed, what you see out, that's just the beginnings of the second growth season. So what you see out there are the very earliest species as far as what's blooming. What the future of the meadow is you push that stuff aside and look for the little tiny plants that were planted at the same time, but that are much slower growing. Plants, well, I'll talk about that because I will get to it momentarily. But the point here is, if you're planting live plants, it's good to put seed in with it. And if you want it to be kind of, sometimes one reason to plant live plants is you can arrange things more and make it a little more garden-esque, and that's true, and we do that. And in that case, the seed mix might be shorter in general than the live plants. So the design that you created is evident, but you still got that intermingled characteristic of a meadow for the various reasons. And so here's an example of a meadow planted with both live plants and seed. And you can see the dense intermingled nature of it. And here is a picture across it of all of the lawns. Now, I haven't been back to this place. I always say when I show this picture, I should go back there to see if any of the other people did a meadow. But one of the things that I was concerned with here is I wanted to, yes, it's going to be natural, but it was designed fairly short. There weren't big, tall, leggy things sticking out of it. You know, the idea was not to thumb your nose and tick off your neighbors intentionally. The idea was not also to do what they do either. So this is kind of a modified meadow planting that kind of fits in the front yard of a neighborhood. And actually, we also planted at the same house a much larger meadow in the backyard that is much wilder looking. Because that's what the clients wanted to see and nobody else sees it. Meadow, a gradual transformation. This is an example of what I think a lot of landscapes can be. The way landscapes typically are done, whether it's a meadow or a garden, is, you know, if you're going to start a meadow and there was turf there or it was a weedy area or whatever, you get rid of the plants you don't want today and you plant what you want tomorrow and then you maintain it. Bigger job, maybe it's more than a day, but you know what I'm saying. And in this project, and I think what is a very good way to go, especially when organic and non-chemicals are intended, is gradual transferal. Not kill today, plant tomorrow, and then manage from there on in. And so what went on here, these 2 slopes on the driveway were turf. And the clients in this case did not want to use any herbicide to kill the turf, number 1. Number 2, in the construction of the house, prior to our involvement, they had denuded, done a lot of grading, and there was a heavy storm, and soil washed, and there was an issue, and they got cited, and this, that, and the other. And so they put sod down for turf, and they were not allowed to remove it. So we couldn't remove the sod. And you can't just put seed into dense sod because it's too much competition for the seeds to germinate. So the idea here was to do a bunch of things that turf grass doesn't like, that meadow either likes or can at least tolerate over a period of time. And so what are the things that meadow doesn't like, or that turf grass doesn't like? Turf grass needs fertilizer. And this wasn't a real rich soil. And so a prairie does not need fertilizer. I would never fertilize a prairie or a meadow. So the first thing we did was apply sulfur to the soil. Why would we do that? Sulfur acidifies the soil. It does the opposite of lime. When you increase the pH of soil, as in lime, you make more of the nutrients available to plants that are in the soil. When you lower the pH, which sulfur does, nutrients become tied up to soil particles and are less available to plants. Turfgrass likes fertilizer, likes high nutrients. The meadow can tolerate extreme low fertility. So that was the first thing we did, mimic infertility. Next thing we did was basically not rip out the grass, but run a thatcher over the grass that bit into the soil a little and just thinned the grass and cut through the roots a little bit. Just roughed it up. It was still there and it was still green. The next thing we did was to spray it, I think 3 times during the growing season with an organic herbicide, which is vinegar-based. That does not kill the plant. It does not translocate to the roots and kill the plant like an herbicide would. But what it does do is burn off the foliage. So 3 times during the year, that grass had no leaves, had to use stored food in the roots to reemerge. And so everything, you know, we're beating the hell out of it. Now finally, I get to the point where instead of solid turf, I can see through. It's scraggly, and I can see through to the soil. Now we split seed, meadow seed into the meadow. And the final act here, and I call this, identify a difference between the plant you want and the plant you don't want, and exploit that difference. And this is a series of those, including lowering fertility. The last thing we're going to do, okay, we plant it. Now, most of the meadow species, certainly the meadow grasses, are late to emerge in the season. Meadow grasses may not even emerge, here's a little different, a little warmer, but till June. There's nothing. They're just roots and not emerging. Turf grass comes up, it's the first thing to show up. In the meadow, the asters, lots of the plants are, the butterfly weed, they're late emerging, not quite as much as the grasses. So our management strategy, normal meadow, once established, you mow it once a year at the end of winter. But our management strategy here was to mow it tight during the spring. So the grass is growing, but the meadow's not. So the grass grows, you cut it. Grass grows, you cut it. Grass grows, you cut it. Now, it's on the cusp of summer. The native plants had not grown yet, so they hadn't been cut. And now the turf grass, which is a cool season plant, as opposed to a warm season group of plants is in the meadow, the meadow plants never got cut because we cut before they grew. The turf grass got cut. Now it's hot summer, and as you know from your lawns, it doesn't grow much in the summer. So basically, by exploiting the different growth period, late for the prairie plants, early for the turf grass, over a period of about 2 years, we ended up with what I would say is as good a meadow as we could do had we scraped all the grass off and planted it in soil. And I think this idea, and here's another thing, my daughter just did a meadow. It was actually in the New York Times recently in the front of her and her husband's house. And they used this method. And one of the good things about it is, aside from you never denuded the place. When you denude soil, you take away all of the competition, and all the weed seeds that were suppressed by the turf grass or whatever was there come up gangbusters. But we never just like denuded it. We slowly replaced meadow plants with replaced the grass with the meadow plants. So there was never a period of time where it was just bare dirt or dead grass if you sprayed it with herbicide. So that gradual transition, and my daughter was amazed because they bought this house pretty recently, and there was existing gardens in the back, and you know they're going to change them. We're in the process of redoing that stuff. But you know they've been trying to keep them reasonably neat in the backyard, and they were spending hours back there. They spent next to nothing in the front yard in this meadow. Less than I would even typically say for a meadow. And the reason was because it was a slow transition and we never just ripped the grass out. We just kept weakening it and weakening it. So here it is. And there's that. This meadow was this is probably year 4 or so. And this was taken last year, and this meadow is about 15 years old now. So one of the things to understand about meadows that's very important is, and I kind of alluded to this, and this is true with any plants, there are plants called ruderal species, and then there are plants that are longer-lived species. A ruderal plant is a plant that when things are disturbed and there's bare soil, it grows really quick, and it forms flowers and disperses seeds really quick because it's very short-lived and it is not very competitive. So it has a short lifespan. And then the longer-lived plants grow, basically if you grow fast, you probably die fast. And if you grow slow, you're long-lived. And so while the Coreopsis and the black-eyed Susan that's out there is having a ball in year 2, the plants that are really going to be the meadow are this big underneath it. The wild quinine and the purple coneflower and the asters and the good guy goldenrods, and they're all underneath. And they're going to replace what you see out there now. It's going to be a completely, you look out there and, oh, there's nice yellow flowers. I can't wait every spring to see the Coreopsis. And, well, you're not. You're going to see different stuff. And here's an example of it. This is a large meadow, also in Connecticut, and that's Coreopsis lanceolata, which is out there, and which you'll see a lot of next year. A little bit of it this year, a lot of it next year. There's it in 3 years. That was probably 3 years into that meadow, based on what I'm seeing growing. And that was 10 or 11 years into it. And you won't even find Coreopsis anymore. Look hard enough, you might find one here or there. Black-eyed Susan was all over the place in there in the early stages, gone. Now it's bee balm, or excuse me, bergamot, and cup plant, and Heliopsis, and all kinds of other stuff in there. And here it is at approximately 20 years. So these things are evolving. They evolve real quick in the first couple years. Year 2 to year 3, you think you were in a different place. You know, year 3 to 4, pretty noticeable, 5 to 6, but years later, things are still entering this system. And that's one of the things that I think makes these plantings so interesting. So now let's move to another place where we're going to look at woods and water, and we're going to go down from 40 acres to less than an acre. So here's a before picture. This is in Hastings on Hudson, and it's a close-in suburb to New York City. It's just the next thing you would run into if you went through Yonkers. And beautiful arts and crafts home that these folks have, and that's before. And I will say that Prue Montgomery, the woman in the picture, was president of the Irvington, New York Garden Club. They had a long history dating back to the early 1900s. They had worked historically with the New York Botanic Garden to do woodland wildflower plantings and things. And Prue was interested in bringing back that kind of natural wild native plant ethic to that garden club, because it wasn't really that way. And she wanted to do that kind of approach at their home in Hastings on Hudson to use it as an example. So here's the front entrance. Simple as a front entrance often should be. This is not some wild meadow with 50 different species all intermingled. But if you're going to do something simple, you know, let's just say look at flowers. If you want something of a perennial nature to be blooming from March through September, you need a lot of different plants. And that's not a simple planting by definition. So at the front entrance here, we want simplicity. So we need plants that have an interest multiple times of the year, whether it's flowers or other things. And so the Amsonia hubrechti, which you can see on the front right corner there, has a beautiful blue flower in the spring. It has a stunning multicolor fall. A lot of perennials are really nice in the fall. People look at shrubs and trees. Perennials also. It's like orange, red, and yellow in the fall. But all year it has that feathery foliage. And there's a contrast between the feathery foliage of the Amsonia and the broader leaf of the skullcap or Scutellaria that's behind it. So a foliage contrast is always occurring, and the Scutellaria is blooming more in the summer. And so there's plants with multiple features during the year. And here's the plan, and the front entrance is to the left, and the upper area is that's the dark green, the darker or lime green is actually a Pennsylvania sedge lawn with a little meadow edge planting. And the lighter green to the left is the only turf grass on the property. And then the lower part, you go down steps and it's like a sunken grotto. So let's kind of look at what's going on there. So this is Pennsylvania sedge lawn. And you can see kind of little meadow edges, which is a hint of what's to come, because when you go to the other side of the house, you're going to encounter a small meadow. That's the only turf grass. And you can see that's the edge of the, in the far ground is the edge of the turf lawn, where you kind of walk along the short meadow that's hinting at what you're going to come to. Here you can see kind of the sedge interjecting into the little meadow garden. And so this is an arts and crafts house. And so the structural aspects that we put in there were intended to relate to what went on, what would have been associated in the landscape of an arts and crafts house. And often they were using what's called stick furniture or rustic furniture and garden structures. And so we wanted to use that type of construction wherever there was a constructed element in the garden. But it's also serving another purpose. Because when you go down in the grotto, it's going to be much wilder. And people like legibility. They like to be able to interpret kind of what they're seeing or see familiarity. And so as we're going to walk through this wild grotto garden, you're going to continually encounter structures along these lines. So it's something to hang your hat on as you move through this landscape that's got all kinds of different stuff going on. So this is entering a very small area behind the house that historically was a cutting garden. The house dates back to early 1900s. It was a cutting garden, pretty much at this point overrun with weeds, and a few of the old plants still remaining. So the idea there, and I always like there to be a story. There's something to hang your hat on intellectually about a place. And so the story here is it was a cutting garden that got let go. That's true. And a few of the cutting garden plants still remain, but there was a meadow outside of it that started seeding in. And so it's this cutting garden that is now being invaded by these meadow plants. And here's an example of it. So this part is planted, and a lot of the plants that we put in there are plants that were used historically in cutting gardens, but are also native plants to meadows. Things like Lobelia syphilitica, and particularly things like some of the tall phlox. And Pearly Everlasting was definitely used as a cutting flower years ago. That's a native plant. And then there were the plants that were there before. Daylily was existing. I'm not going to rip it out because it's not native. It's fine. And it's part of the history of that place, number one. And the other plant is Daisy fleabane. That's kind of a meadow plant. We didn't even plant it. That's the only true the non-lie part of the story, because that is a meadow plant that came in on its own, and that is a plant from the old garden. But then as you continue through that, here's another one of these rustic structures that we're going to keep encountering, and that's wisteria planted on there. Now wisteria, this is not Chinese, the Asian wisteria, which is highly invasive and which I would never plant. This is the native wisteria, Wisteria frutescens. But it's serving two purposes, because especially this part of the garden is intended to associate with the house. And wisteria, Chinese wisteria, would have commonly been planted at that house. But we're not going to plant that, so we planted the native form of it, which is not invasive. You go through the arbor and you get this view down into the grotto of the pond that we built that is at the far end of the property. Just beyond that bench is the end of the property. So you get a view of the pond, but then as you continue on the path, you're going to lose the view of the pond. And one of the things, I said this place is under an acre. One of the strategies to make the place feel bigger, more interesting, is to not allow you to ever see the entire parameter of the place. You can never see all of the borders. And there is kind of an optical illusion or a trick that our mind plays on us. Whatever it is, let's say it's a swath of turf that disappears behind a shrub border, and you can't see behind the shrub border. That shrub border may be that plot may be 20 square feet, but your brain thinks it's bigger. When something disappears behind something else, you feel like it's bigger. So a really good strategy, some people figure instinctively, oh, if you got a small place, don't put a lot of big plants, it'll be, overwhelming. And you don't want to fill it up with big plants. But strategically placed big plants, whether they're a shrub or a tall perennial, basically creates lots of different spaces. You go around something, you see a whole different view than you saw before, and the landscape becomes much more dynamic. So keep that in mind as we're traveling through this place. So here's the stairs that are going to go down. Now, down in the grotto had not been maintained for many years, and was very, very overgrown. 2 shrubs were the main woody plants that were in there underneath the trees. And they were spice bush, native plant, and Seabold viburnum, a non-native plant, which I never considered invasive, but I now do because it was all over the place with the spice bush. But underneath, because it had been let go for a number of years, on the ground layer, there were some nice plants. For instance, we planted bloodroot there. We planted the serum there, the ginger, but we didn't plant the sensitive fern on the left. That was already there. And as you go through this, you're going to see, well, there's spice bush, which is a desirable native plant. You're going to see things that were existing that were desirable. And they wouldn't have been there if it was all mowed lawn with highly weeded gardens on the perimeter, as a typical place would have been. So the fact that it was let go for a while actually gave us a lot more to work with than if it hadn't been. Now that doesn't mean let go of your yard until it turns into a holy mess, and then call a landscape designer to help you out. The point is, though, that in places, let things happen. Such as here, if you let things, you're not going to do this by your front door, but out in the perimeter, particularly a place where, identify what's there. Okay, that's an invasive weed. I don't like that. That's an ugly weed. I don't like that. Oh, look, there's a little white wood aster there. That's a native plant. Common, no big deal, but it's a native plant. If there's perimeter areas on your property that have been let go a little bit, look for the desirable plants in there. Remove what's not and see what happens. And utilize those things. Maybe take some turf out on the perimeter and just scarf it away and let whatever grows, grows, and then referee what comes in. Small little area if you want it to be. Because I think the idea of natural recruitment of plants, we plant everything in our gardens pretty much in most cases, and in nature stuff grows. Wherever you do nothing, stuff's going to grow. Well, yeah, a lot of it's weeds, plants we don't want, but not all of it is. So let's go down the stairs, and here's mayapple that was there. We pulled some weed stuff from it, but beyond it was all weeds, and so that's Packer aureus or golden groundsel. So we're planting where there's nothing good, and where we got something good, we're not only not killing it, but we're encouraging it to expand, because that mayapple patch wasn't as big as it is now when it was surrounded by aggressive weeds that we removed. Now here's a little sitting area with a fire pit in the middle of it, and the shrub you're seeing around it was spice bush. Now the 2 shrubs, spice bush and Seabold viburnum, covered the whole grotto, basically. So we got rid of the Seabold viburnum. The spice bush is really a good shrub. I plant it sometimes, but it was throughout. So we didn't want it to be that dominant. So we're going to remove some and leave some. And so where we remove it and where we don't is a big part of the design. And in this situation, that was all a thicket of spice bush once we got rid of the Seabold viburnum. And I wanted to put this little circular bench with a fire pit in that spot, and I wanted it to be secluded. So instead of saying, okay, let's get rid of the plants there and put our circular bench and plant some seclusion around it, we just removed the spice bush in the center and did the construction and left the spice bush in the perimeter, and that's a garden space that nothing was planted. Okay, we're right on the edge of that. That's the edge of the bench, and we're looking out at a tree snag, and all of that was planted because that was all weeds that we removed. But the Paulownia tree, that snag, during the planting of this project, that was a huge tree up on the sidewalk, and it came down in a storm, and it literally, the head of that tree filled the entire yard. So obviously that wasn't going to work. We had to get rid of it. But we did notice that a section of it was very sculptural, a section of the trunk. So we had the arborist cut out that section and planted it there. And for those of you who don't realize, these dead snags are really, really good for wildlife. Insects are burrowing into them, birds are feeding on them, the woodpeckers, and they become very sculptural with age also. So it became a feature in the garden, improvised, because I didn't know that was going to happen when we designed it. And let's walk out on the path beyond it. If you can kind of see, if you look at this picture, you see off to the right of it, there's a log laying there. I wanted to point it out here because it's a big old tree log that had come down many years before. And I felt it was just too out there in this small space. But I really liked it and certainly didn't want to take it away. So what we did was plant the native wisteria to cover it over in part. And again, this is a repetition. That wisteria was used in a more formal situation on that arbor, and now it's used just to cascade over a log. But there are plants that get repeated, as well as the stick furniture and structures that get repeated. And so as wild as this place is, you kind of understand it. So that's part of the surface of it. It really that's what a snag does eventually too. I mean, they get really sculptural in the textural qualities, and things grow on them, the moss and stuff. So what part of the maintenance of this place, and this is really minor maintenance, is maybe once a year go over to that log and find the coolest little patterns on the log and just cut the wisteria off it. You're talking about 15 minutes, a half hour. This is not major stuff. But when you walk along that log, it's like a series of little paintings framed by the wisteria. So continuing along the path, you come to another little sitting area, which is, again, stick furniture. And now we're coming out of the shady woodland, and we're on the edge of a little meadow patch. And so again, I was saying, okay, the plants that are native to the ecoregion, not necessarily just the state, but there's lots of different environments within that ecoregion, and they're on this property. There's a little sunny patch, which we're about to go to. There's shady areas, which are where we've mostly walked so far on the grotto side of the property. And there's woodland edge, what in ecology is called the ecotone, which is a transitional plant grouping that transitions from one type of plant community to another. And the most common one in our part of the world is the woodland edge, which is transitioning from the open field or meadow to the woods. And so that's what this is. And if you look up, the ferns were actually already there. We planted the Monarda didyma, or bee balm, in with it. And if you look at the plant community books that list what plants grow in certain places, grow together in certain environments, you'll find this fern and you'll find Monarda didyma. So we're actually looking at the plant that we already have and saying, okay, what are the plants that tends to associate with that plant? And we're pretty likely to be picking a plant in that. If the fern got there on itself, by itself, when you have one native plant that showed up on its own, that is telling you two things. It's telling you that plant wants to be there and you're likely to be very successful if you use it. And if you look up the other plants that tend to grow with it, the same thing is true. So 2 or 3 little butterfly weeds or 2 or 3 little marginal wood ferns that might show up on anybody's property it's an intellectual windfall, because it's telling you, oh, okay, all the plants that grow with that plant are the plants that are going to do really well on my property. It's not just, the property here was telling us to some extent. We're testing the soil and we're looking at the light patterns and we're doing all the things we're supposed to do. But we're also looking, because they had not maintained this garden for a long time, and there were plants that were allowed to naturally establish, I got a lot more information. And in places that are not like that, I'm often going somewhere to a nearby natural area that is in a similar environmental condition and looking at what plants are growing there. What's the closest nature center or land conservancy place? And do they have a meadow? Because you want to do a meadow. I want to see what's there. Do they have this? Do they have that? So we're really very literal when we say we're planting native plants and everything will be perfect because we're planting native plants. Well, what's a native plant and who is it associated with? And when you put plants together that associate together in nature, not only if one of them grew naturally and you gave that plant its associates, they're all probably very adapted to that place. They're also adapted to growing with each other. They don't look like they're fighting it out as much because they've co-evolved together in this place. And so the bee balm and the fern just looks like, it's too densely planted from a perennial guidebook plant, but they grow together in nature and that's what they do, and it looks pretty balanced to me. So now we're in the meadow, and there's bluebells, and there's, again, golden groundsel, Packer aureus, which is a plant we planted in a lot of places, another kind of flagship plant that you can kind of recognize as you travel through. But this actually isn't the scene I wanted you to see all year. This is early spring. That's the meadow. It's just coming up, and it's short. And as you come down that path, you can see the pond. I don't want to see the pond from there, and you won't as the season progresses, because on the back side of the pond is planted Joe Pye weed. So as you walk down the side of the meadow, anytime other than the spring, you don't see the pond. There's a path just to this side of that Joe Pye weed. You're just walking along the shorter meadow on your right and the tall meadow on your left. And then all of a sudden you come to a spot where we didn't plant the Joe Pye weed, so that there's a little window and you just see a little piece of the pond and another piece of the stick furniture that you keep encountering, and then you get lost in Joe Pye weed again as you continue on the path until you start coming around, and there were some shrubs here, some native azaleas, some winterberry hollies, and now you can see underneath them. So instead of that little far off window of the pond, you're getting a little close-up window of the pond and a filtered view. So it's being revealed kind of gradually until you come around the shrubs, and then you get the whole picture. Again, if there was no height, I would have seen the pond as soon as I walked through that arbor, and I'd go down the steps and I still see the pond, and I go to the circular bench and I still see the pond, and there's nothing to discover. And there's just a close-up of the cascade, and always if you're going to do a waterfall, make sure that it looks like water could actually travel that way. I see a lot of waterfalls, it looks like, well, the water went up the backside and back down the front side. In this case, this whole thing is sloped, so it's real. There have been times where we've done where, the slope didn't really say that there could be water flowing that way, but in that case, we're going to thicket up behind it so you can't see what's behind it, and even though it is going up, it is recirculating. I don't know, I keep hitting this thing. It is recirculating. You can't really tell. So, and here's an aquatic bench on the edge of the pond where stones were placed. Oops, sorry about that. Where stones were placed to create real shallow water where things like blue flag iris and other aquatic plants can be planted. And then as you continue around the pond, first you see the big picture, and then as you continue around, you encounter these little micro spots. So this is Prue's husband, Clark. And Clark Montgomery is so enthusiastic about this place. And he has, Prue wants it to be an example for other people to do ecology-based landscaping, and Clark just loves to have people here enjoying it. And so multiple times of the year he puts on these events that people come to. And his enthusiasm is really makes me very happy. However, Clark is legally blind. He does not need assistance to move around. He sees enough that he can walk around and be okay in that way. But he sees no detail in anything, and he sees no color. And he loves this garden. And what I'm saying here is, and what Clark realized, it's not just about pretty scenes. It should be pretty. I think it is. However, it's not just that. It's how you feel being in it. And Clark sent me this note at one point. This is a picture of one of the visits he had with folks. The prevailing response to being in this garden seems to be much more emotional than just aesthetic or intellectual. I don't mean to wax philosophical here, but it is indeed exciting for us to see firsthand the enthusiastic and quite visceral reactions people have to the surprises and delights they find. And my favorite word in that is visceral. You know, he's not seeing detail. So here's a picture of the pond before. Here's a picture of the pond after. This is during Clark's Halloween party, where a few hundred people come through this little 1 acre thing. That was early on. Clark Montgomery, you know, he put like scary stuff all over the place. And it got scarier year after year. Clark would not hurt the hair on the head of any human being. He is the nicest guy. But this Halloween thing is getting more vicious every single year. So something's down in there with Clark. I don't know. It never comes out other than this. So there's the pond a couple of years later, and there's the snag with the devil up there, or whatever the heck he is. And Clark and Prue eventually sold this house and moved to Cape Cod, which they had a summer house. And so new folks bought it. And there's the snag. And there's something different in front of the snag. These are different people. They have different interests. And one of the things that I kind of realized, and I visited, you know, with those folks, and they are keeping the garden, you know, they're keeping it as it was intended and are very much into it. But what I kind of realized is that I think this setting, which I think Clark, the visceral and experiential aspect of this setting possibly engenders personal expression within it. You know, Clark has his party with people coming, and these folks are putting some of their religion out there, and these are personal expressions that I'm not so sure would have either happened or been as effective if it was sitting in the lawn in front of, on the edge of a garden bed. And then on the other side of the property, here's what used to be the sedge lawn. And I'm not disappointed, because the Montgomerys had no kids and they did not need any lawn, and these folks had 2 young kids and they need lawn to throw around. They can't do that in the sedge lawn, so the sedge lawn got mowed. And that's okay. You know, part of this is about how people want to live. And how they interact with the landscape. And if they're feeling guilty about, oh my God, I have too much lawn because it's not what you're supposed to. No, it's not about that. It's do what you think is right, and your property, you should be sharing your property, not giving your property away to wildlife, sharing your property with wildlife. And that means having things that are unique to your interests, your beliefs, and whatever. And so the last image I'll show you, there's a stick that just fell out of a tree into the packer. And Rob Cardillo is the photographer. He's one of the best photographers in the country. He was there to do a magazine shoot on this property. I wasn't there for anything to do with the magazine thing, but he took a picture of that. First of all, if that was mowed turf, the ground would have been much harder and that stick would have just bounced off and laid on the ground. But more interestingly is, if that stick did fall out of a tree and stick in the turf in the middle of that yard, Rob Cardillo would not have been interested in taking a picture of it. So whether it's personal expression or whether it's just setting a palette for things to happen, whether they're new plants that come in that you didn't plant, that are intermingling with the ones that you did plant, or a stick falling out of a tree that's architectural, you're setting the stage for a lot more than just planting plants, which is cool enough in and of itself. So I'll finish it there. Hopefully we have some time for questions, and be happy to take them. Thank you very much.